The morning had that strange heaviness before a storm, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Maple Creek, a town that clung to the edge of farmland and forest, looked smaller under the darkening sky. Clouds bunched together like fists, and every so often, a low growl of thunder rolled across the hills. Tom Walker stood on the porch of his little rental, mug of cheap coffee in hand, staring at the horizon. His oldest, Lila, sat cross-legged inside, coloring quietly, while her younger brother Mason built a shaky tower of mismatched toy blocks. Their voices were soft, too soft for children their age. They had learned quickly not to make noise when their father needed to think. Bills lay spread across the kitchen table, a battlefield of overdue notices in red ink. Tom tried not to look at them, but the numbers pressed at the back of his mind like a toothache. He had worked a 12-hour shift at the lumberyard yesterday, came home bone-tired, and still lay awake half the night, running calculations he knew would never add up. Then he noticed the house across the street. Margaret Cole's place was older than most in town, a wide, low farmhouse with a wraparound porch. Its roof sagged on one side, the shingles curling and lifting from the last windstorm. Tom squinted, watching one piece teeter dangerously. If the storm hit tonight the way the radio predicted, half the roof might peel right off. He sighed. He didn't really have time for this. He didn't even have proper materials. What he did have was a stubborn conscience and a toolbox he'd inherited from his father, who drilled into him that a man who ignores his neighbor's broken roof might as well be the one who let it fall. "Dad," Lila's small voice pulled him back. "Are we gonna be okay when the storm comes?" Tom turned. Her brown eyes were wide, full of a fear she tried to swallow. He crouched and smoothed a strand of hair behind her ear. "We'll be fine," he promised. "Long as we've got each other, we'll be fine." But when he looked back at Margaret's house, the words felt thin. He knew Margaret, at least in passing. She was in her late 60s, sharp-eyed, and polite in that formal way older folks sometimes carried themselves. She didn't come to block parties or church socials, but she always waved when she drove past. Rumor had it she'd moved to Maple Creek after her husband died, but nobody knew much else. Tom set his coffee down and grabbed his work gloves. "Stay inside," he told the kids. "I'm gonna help Miss Cole before the storm hits." He carried his ladder across the street, the aluminum legs clanking against the gravel. Margaret was already on her porch, as if she'd been watching him. She wore a faded sweater and clutched a shawl around her shoulders. "Mr. Walker," she called, concern etched in her voice, "you don't have to trouble yourself with this." Tom planted the ladder and tested its steadiness. "Ma'am, I can't just stand by and watch your roof give out. If this storm's as bad as they say, you could be in real danger." She pressed her lips together, as though she wanted to argue but knew he wouldn't be swayed. "Don't you have your own home to worry about?" she asked softly. Tom climbed the first rung, toolbox swinging at his side. "Yes, ma'am, but I've got kids. I know what it means to keep a roof over their heads. That's why I'm here." The wind stirred, and a loose shingle flapped weakly like a flag surrendering. Tom climbed higher, his jaw set. Every step up that ladder felt heavier than the last, not because of the height, but because he carried with him the weight of a man who had more than enough burdens already. But he couldn't ignore this one. The ladder rattled as Tom climbed higher, toolbox knocking against each rung. By the time he reached the roofline, the air had thickened with that strange greenish tint storms always carried, the kind that made even daylight look uneasy. The first thing he noticed was how brittle the shingles had become. He crouched, running a calloused hand over the warped edges. They crumbled like stale crackers under his touch. He muttered under his breath, tightening his grip on the hammer. "Careful up there," Margaret called from the porch. Her voice was taut, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked small against the wide, empty street. "I'll be fine, ma'am," Tom answered, though the truth was he wasn't sure. He hadn't been on a roof in years, and his arms still ached from yesterday's shift. But fine or not, he kept working. He pulled a handful of nails from his belt pouch and started hammering the loose shingles back into place. Each strike rang out sharp against the rolling thunder overhead. The sound seemed to echo into the air, as if the sky itself was counting down. Wind picked up, tugging at his shirt, making the ladder sway against the eaves. Tom braced himself low, knees bent, sweat sliding down his neck despite the cooling air. He worked methodically, shingle by shingle, willing himself not to think about how much roof still stretched ahead of him. At one point, a loose nail slipped from his fingers, clinking down the slope and vanishing into the grass below. He swore under his breath. From the porch, Margaret stepped forward. "You don't need to push yourself like this. The storm will be here any minute." Tom paused, pressing the back of his wrist to his forehead. His chest rose and fell heavy. He looked down at her worried eyes, her hands twisting the shawl's fringe, and then he thought of his kids at home, watching the clouds thicken from their window. "I can't stop now," he said. "If I leave it half done, the wind'll tear the rest apart." A fat raindrop splashed onto the roof beside him. Then another. Soon the shingles glistened with scattered drops, each one making the surface slicker. Tom shifted his footing, moving carefully, knowing one wrong step could send him sliding. The storm was coming fast now. Trees at the edge of the street bent under sudden gusts, their leaves swirling loose like frantic birds. Thunder cracked overhead, loud enough to shake the air in his lungs. Still, Tom kept hammering. His arms burned, his knuckles were raw, but he kept at it until he could feel the roof solidify beneath his hands, each nailed shingle holding fast against the growing wind. Margaret moved to the edge of the yard, her voice raised over the storm. "You've done enough. Please, come down before you hurt yourself." Tom glanced back, teeth gritted. Just a few more. The hammer slipped once, glancing off his thumb, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his hand. He hissed but shook it off, driving the nail home with extra force. Lightning flashed, turning the whole world white for an instant. In that moment, Tom's silhouette stood stark against the sky, a lone man bent against the storm, hammer in hand, refusing to give in. When at last he hammered the final shingle into place, he exhaled hard, lungs burning. He sat back on his heels, chest heaving, rain soaking his shirt. For a moment, he allowed himself to just breathe. "All right," he called down hoarsely. "She'll hold." Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, relief softening her features. Tom made his way carefully back to the ladder, gripping each rung like a lifeline as the rain poured harder, drumming against the roof he'd just secured. His muscles screamed, but he climbed down steady, one step at a time, until his boots touched the wet grass. Margaret met him there, eyes shining not only with gratitude, but with something he didn't yet understand. By the time Tom stepped back into his house, the storm had fully arrived. Rain sheeted down in silver walls outside, rattling the windows. Wind howled through the gaps in the siding, making the whole structure creak like an old ship at sea. Lila and Mason ran to him the second he came through the door. "Dad," Mason squeaked, clutching his soaked pant leg. "You're all wet." "I'm all right, buddy," Tom said, ruffling his son's hair, though his voice carried the rasp of exhaustion. His shirt clung to him, water dripping from his sleeves onto the worn linoleum. Lila's eyes searched his face. "Did you fix it? Is Miss Cole safe?" Tom crouched, wincing at the pull in his tired muscles. "She's safe. Roof's not going anywhere tonight." Relief bloomed on her face, and she hugged him tightly, small arms squeezing as if she could anchor him in place. He closed his eyes and let the moment steady him. For all his weariness, for all the weight on his shoulders, this, his children safe in his arms, was what kept him climbing ladders and fighting storms. The night dragged on with the fury of nature. The power went out just after 8, leaving the house lit only by the orange glow of a single lantern. Mason fell asleep curled against his sister on the couch, but Tom couldn't rest. He sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the sheets of rain. From where he sat, he could just make out Margaret's house across the street. Through the storm, her lights flickered once, then steadied. He pictured her inside, safe beneath the roof he'd secured, perhaps sipping tea, perhaps whispering a prayer of thanks. The thought warmed him briefly before his mind drifted back to the stack of bills on the table. Tomorrow, the storm would pass, but the weight of debt, the strain of making ends meet, that storm never seemed to leave. When morning finally came, it was as if the world had been scrubbed raw. The sky was pale and washed out, the streets littered with branches, shingles, and trash cans. Puddles reflected the broken pieces of the storm's violence. Tom stepped onto the porch, the damp boards cool under his boots. His muscles screamed in protest, but he inhaled the quiet relief of survival. The kids were still asleep, wrapped together in a blanket, when a knock sounded at the door. Tom opened it to find Margaret standing there. Her clothes were dry and neat despite the chaos outside, her silver hair pinned carefully, though her eyes carried the same exhaustion he felt. In her hand, she held a leather briefcase. "Mr. Walker," she said softly, her voice touched with a weight he hadn't heard before. Tom rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Morning, ma'am. Roof held fine, didn't it?" "It did," she said. "Because of you. You worked until you were soaked through. You could have been hurt." He shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Couldn't let it fall in on you. Wasn't much of a choice." Her lips pressed into a thin smile, not of amusement but of something deeper, recognition, perhaps. She lifted the briefcase slightly. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Walker?" she asked. He frowned. "Margaret Cole, my neighbor." She nodded. "Yes, but I'm also the sole owner of Cole and Ashworth Holdings. My late husband built it. Farmland, railroads, even half the rental properties in this state, they're mine now." The word stunned him. He blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. "You own half the state." "In a manner of speaking," she said. "But what matters is this. I watched you last night. You didn't fix that roof for money or recognition. You did it because it was right. That kind of man is rare. And I think the world would be better if someone like you had a chance to stand on steadier ground." She opened the briefcase. Inside were papers neatly stacked, and an envelope with Tom's name written across it. "I'd like to offer you something," she continued. "A job, not charity. Work, steady, fair, and honest. Enough that your children will never have to worry the way you do now." Tom's throat tightened. He glanced back at the sleeping figures of his children, then at Margaret. "Why me?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Because," she said, eyes kind but unyielding, "any man who climbs onto a stranger's roof in a storm will take care of whatever I put in his hands." For the first time in years, Tom felt something shift in his chest, not relief exactly, but the fragile beginning of hope. For a long moment, Tom stood in the doorway, the storm-washed morning stretching quiet behind Margaret's words. The envelope in her hand might as well have weighed 100 pounds. He rubbed his palm over his damp jeans, his pride pricking sharper than the calluses on his skin. He had spent years scraping by on odd jobs and long shifts, telling himself he'd make it on his own. That he had to. Accepting help had always felt like weakness, like admitting he wasn't enough. "Ma'am," he began, voice low, "I don't take handouts." Margaret's lips curved, not in offense but in understanding. "This isn't a handout, Mr. Walker. It's work, real work, and from what I saw last night, you don't shy from that." Behind him, little feet padded across the floor. Lila, still rumpled from sleep, tugged at the hem of his shirt. Mason peeked from behind her, thumb tucked into his mouth, wide-eyed at the sight of Margaret on their porch. "Daddy," Lila whispered. "Who's she?" Tom knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "This is Miss Cole. She's offering me a job." Lila blinked, her brow furrowed the way her mother's used to when she was thinking hard. "A good job." Tom hesitated, the word catching in his throat. He looked at Margaret, then at his children, their small bodies thin from too many skipped meals, their clothes patched more times than he could count. "Yes," Margaret said gently, as if answering for him. "A good job. One that will let your father come home at night instead of working until you're asleep. One that will let you grow up without worry." Mason tugged at Tom's sleeve. "Can we get more peanut butter if you take it?" The innocence of the question hit Tom harder than any storm. His throat burned, and he pulled both kids into his arms, pressing his face against their hair. Margaret waited quietly, giving him space. When Tom finally rose, his voice was steady, though his eyes were rimmed with fatigue and something softer, acceptance. "I'll work, ma'am, but not for favors. You give me a fair day's wage, and I'll give you more than a fair day's effort." Margaret's smile deepened, lines softening around her eyes. "That's all I ask." She handed him the envelope. It was thick, sealed, his name written in a hand that spoke of old-world care. Inside, he knew, would be more than just paperwork. It was a doorway, a chance. Tom took it, the weight solid in his hand. Behind him, The kids began to chatter, Lila whispering about what she'd do if Dad didn't have to work nights, Mason humming happily at the thought of more peanut butter sandwiches. Their hope filled the small house like sunlight through a broken window. For the first time in a long time, Tom let himself imagine it, dinners at the table instead of reheated leftovers in the dark. School supplies bought new instead of begged from neighbors. Laughter that wasn't dulled by exhaustion. He looked back at Margaret, the woman whose roof he'd nailed together with shaking hands just hours before. She didn't look like a tycoon who owned half the state. She just looked like a neighbor who had seen him, really seen him, when no one else had. "Thank you," he said simply. Margaret inclined her head. "No, Mr. Walker. Thank you for reminding me that strength doesn't come from wealth. It comes from character." As she turned to leave, the morning sun broke fully through the clouds, scattering gold across the wet street. Tom stood in the doorway with his children, envelope in hand, watching light spill over a world that, for once, felt like it might finally be kind to him.